So we have a great panel, and bios are in the program. We actually do have a great replacement, Ilya Shapiro. Thank you very much for replacing Devin Westhill, who's stuck in Jacksonville because of the hurricane. We've also been joined by John Yu and Kenny Zhu to talk about the potential world that may exist post-race-based affirmative action in higher education. As many of you know, a week ago Monday, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in both the Harvard and UNC cases. And based on the questions, certainly from the more conservative side of the aisle, it seemed that there was some healthy skepticism. And so we're going to have a discussion today about, none of us know for sure, but based on what we think is going to occur, what are the implications, not only in higher education, but in almost any other area where race-based affirmative action has been the norm. So to start, rapid fire, based on the oral arguments that you heard, based on the composition of the court, yes or no, will race-based affirmative action in higher ed survive the Supreme Court decision when it comes down? John?
No.
Kenny? No. Oh, we have, unfortunately, one mic. Yes, we have to. Yeah.
6-3, no.
Oh, Kenny provided a little bit nicer level of detail there, John.
Well, except 6-2 in the Harvard case with Jackson recused, but that's just a legal point. For practical purposes, it's going to be messy.
Okay, and I concur. Looking at the actual data of the case, it's almost impossible to come away with a conclusion that particularly Asian students were clearly discriminated against in favor of Black and Hispanic students. But why? So why is it that you, John, can respond with such certainty?
One thing about just the law and then one thing about the court. In terms of the law, the court has case by case said that race cannot be used by the government for any reason. Not for national security reasons, not for law enforcement reasons, not for giving out contracts, not for hiring. So in all of the government's activities, for some strange reason, the court says the only place you're allowed to use race is college admissions. This is such a bizarre anomaly in just the structure of the law that I think the court's going to eliminate it. In terms of this particular court, Chief Justice Roberts, who's often seen as the moderating force on the 3 Trump justices, and then Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, who have been very clear, at least Alito and Thomas have been very clear their opposition to racial preferences. This is the one area where I think Chief Justice Roberts does not play games, does not try to balance, does not try to build coalitions. Every time he has had a chance to vote against race-based government action, he has. He struck down the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which I thought the court would never do. That is actually a much more serious step in terms of the law than getting rid of race-based affirmative action for college admissions.
Okay. And Kenny, why are you so certain, not only in the decision, but 6-3 decision?
Well, I say 6-3 because if you listen to the oral arguments, and I did for about 5 hours, it's very clear that at least on this issue, and probably on other issues, but at least on this issue, the liberal justices just have a very different view of the law than the rest of the justices. They just have a very different view. And this view is predicated off of this new idea of progressive originalism, where basically Harvard made this argument that the Constitution was never supposed to be colorblind. That was Harvard's argument. You know, the 14th Amendment was supposed to provide redress for slavery, but it included race-conscious measures, and so therefore race-conscious measures are viable. And the liberal justices, you could see, contorted themselves into believing that argument. Justice Sotomayor even went so far as to say, we still live in a time when there's de jure segregation, which means rightful, which is very interesting, why she would say that. You know, effectively, the systemic racism argument holds extreme sway for progressives and for liberals. And that's why they're not going to vote even for the abolition of actual racial discrimination of Asians.
So there's a practical point and a more deeper cut theoretical point. The practical point, there were two key points during the oral argument. One was, again and again, different justices asked advocates for the racial preferences regimes to give them an end point. And nobody could come up with that. Nobody could even give a metric for what we would need to see to end this system. That made many justices uncomfortable. And secondly, the fateful exchange between Seth Waxman, Harvard's lawyer, the former Solicitor General, and Chief Justice Roberts, when Roberts asked whether race was ever determinative, because it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be one of many factors, never determinative. And Waxman conceded that it was. And in fact, that 45% of black and Hispanic students at Harvard would not have gotten in without racial preferences. That's pretty huge. But then Waxman said, but you know, it's only in certain cases, like if akin to if the orchestra needs an oboe player, and then we might give a tip to an applicant who's an oboe player. And then Roberts replied, well, we didn't fight a civil war over oboe players, which created a lot of Twitter memes. So anyway, that's the practical side of things that really drop the scales from our eyes, I think. The deeper cut issue is that this court really doesn't like the 1970s era kind of wishy-washy, hand-waving, multi-factor balancing tests. We saw that with Roe v. Wade being overturned. We saw that with Lemon versus Kurtzman in the Establishment Clause area. Last year, they just recognized that it had long ago been abandoned. This year, the Dormant Commerce Clause, which I won't get into, but the Pike balancing test from the 70s, and similarly, Bakke here, that thin reed, the one vote by Justice Powell on which our whole diversity edifice is built, I think is going to come crumbling down.
Yep. On the timeline point, I mean, it was the Grutter case. I don't need it. I think that Sandra Day O'Connor actually did lay out a 25-year timeline, and so we may be getting to that point a little bit faster. One piece of data that I thought was so interesting in the information that was presented by SFFA was that nearly 2/3 of the black students that were enrolled in Harvard were not economically disadvantaged. Right? These were kids of middle and upper income families, and good for them, but it became clear that a lot of well-off black kids were being accepted into Harvard and displacing low-income kids of all races. How much do you think that plays into just the entire purpose of this to start with?
One interesting thing from oral argument I thought was what a poor job Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill did defending their regimes. It's almost like, I mean, this is why I think we can be confident. They almost thought, they seem to think they're going to lose too. And so they were taking positions that are not really designed to win this case, it seemed to me, but to prepare the ground for continued cheating. So that's why, right, when these kinds of issues came up, they never responded with any facts, with any data. They never tried to refute any kind of factual statements, because what they want to do, I think, next, I think this is the challenge, and it's very much what happened after Brown versus Board of Education, I'm afraid, unfortunately, is that they're just going to submerge race and use a lot of pretexts, but still have this in mind. And it goes to what Kenny said, because one thing that did come clear in oral argument is the advocates, Harvard and UNC Chapel ministers, like racial diversity has become like their high church. This is the thing they most believe in. They can't really imagine that it's wrong, at least in the way they're pursuing it. So one question Justice Thomas asked, and several times, and Justice Alito too, said, what's the evidence that racial diversity in the way you practice it, with a lot of high socioeconomics classes benefiting from it, actually improves anyone's educational outcomes? You'd think you would have an answer for that. You might be able to prove it data. They just refuse to answer that question. I thought that was amazing because they would know it would be coming. The reason I think they don't want to answer it is because it has to do more with the future.
And it would reveal the weakness of their case. Kenny, the role of Asian American students, certainly in this case and many others, has really emerged as, it's so obvious that a particular racial group it's been deemed acceptable to discriminate against that group, and it seems really that realization is coming to an end. So what do you think, how has the role of Asian American students in particular changed the nature of the debate?
Yeah, because it shows that there are real victims of diversity. That's why the Asians are important. I mean, the Asians have to score 270 points higher on the SAT to have the same chance of admission as a black student. They get rated lowest on the personality score by Harvard, even though they have the highest teacher recommendations and the highest scores on the alumni recommendations. The personality score that Harvard uses is determinative for you to get into Harvard. So this subjective metric that Harvard uses puts upon these stereotypes of these Asian Americans as low personality test-taking robots so that they can discriminate against them. And it shows that there are real victims of diversity. So John said, the church of diversity. This is what these people really believe in. And they can't possibly think that there are any harms to diversity whatsoever. I can name you 3. Number 1, the real victimhood of non-preferred groups like Asian Americans who have to score higher to have the same chance, and even then they don't get in. Number 2, the underperformance of kids who are admitted into diversity. At these top law schools, black kids tend to graduate at the bottom 25% of their class. Why? Because they're admitted because of affirmative action. And when you graduate the bottom 25%, you're not going to get a high-paying job. You're not going to get the career that you want. You're going to come to this place with hopes and dreams and expectations that you don't get, and you're going to blame yourself, or you're going to blame the institution, or you're going to blame racism. And then number 3, there is no evidence actually out there that actually shows that diversity at the expense of admitting the most qualified candidate, because that's what it's really about. It's not about diversity. It's about diversity at the expense of meritocracy. There's no evidence that that actually results in more higher performing groups, and I think that that's this whole idea of building a regime off of diversity, it's totally unsubstantiated.
Yeah, and what's interesting about everything you just said, each time you use the word diversity, there's an invisible word in front of that, racial, and you don't even need to say it because, what about viewpoint diversity or any other adjectives, but even not having to say the word is evidence of how this ideology has penetrated.
Well, David Latt, who's a keen observer of everything in the legal profession, has a Substack called Original Jurisdiction, which I recommend. I also recommend my own Substack, Shapiro's Gavel. But he wrote about how this was about visual diversity, right? The cliche about the United Colors of Benetton ad where everyone looks different but thinks the same, right? Because you can have lots of different kinds of diversity. You can have people who want to be science majors and humanities majors and art majors and engineering majors. That's a diversity. You can have geographic diversity. You can have socioeconomic diversity, or just diversity of experience, right? And I'm hoping that colleges will move to that kind of, or a diversity of opinion for that matter, right? Or intellectual diversity of various kinds. But what we're really talking about here in this legal case, in this whole political controversy is, and I think David did well to coin this term, visual diversity.
Yep.
Just one real quick thing on what he said. It's visual diversity because they don't actually care about, it's not actually about the black kids, or it's not actually about the minority kids. There's studies that show that the presence of so-called diversity affects white kids' entrance or desire to enter into these universities, not black kids. In fact, the admission because of affirmative action causes black kids to actually change majors out of things like math and science into gender studies and Africana studies and English because they feel like they're not qualified in that present. So it's actually for the white kids, it's diversity for the white kids at the expense of the black kids. Think about that.
Yep. So with certainty, we all are saying the race-based affirmative action is essentially dead on college campuses. But I'd like each one of you to respond to put yourself now in the position of being a college president, where you have, let's say, 500 students in your incoming class, or 500 seats, and you have 10,000 applications. What should be a fair way to honor individual dignity, opportunity, while balancing this other idea of quote-unquote group representation? What's your advice to a college president who honors this decision but still values true diversity? Each of you, I'd love for you to respond.
If I was a college president, I would immediately resign and go back to research and teaching. Why would I ever want a terrible job like that? For the great perks. So I think it's as you suggested earlier, Ian, as a classroom teacher, I find that diversity that really adds to education is socioeconomic diversity and geographic diversity. I'm way out in Berkeley, California. I love to see some Southerners in class. We get very few people from the South, people from the inner city, people who have really struggled. So that's the kind of diversity. Those are the people that bring the most different perspectives.
And viewpoint diversity, presumably, too.
Yeah, viewpoint. Well, I find like that when they have those kinds of, they will have different viewpoints just because of where they went to high school or college, the kind of challenges they had to overcome.
So it's a byproduct, not necessarily intentional.
Because I don't know if I'd actually want to college presidents and college administrators to actually try to find viewpoint diversity, because I don't really trust how they would try to do it. But like with socioeconomic diversity, at some level you can prove it and work with that as a real factor. I think that's actually a much better proxy for the kinds of, oh man. That's the last, well, it's not the last time I'm ever going to bring a McDonald's drink in, but Ronald's going to hear from me about the top. Gosh. Sorry about that. So, and so I think it's something you can actually administer. It may not necessarily yield the, as Ilya said, the visual diversity that people want, but we have done this at the University of California. After Prop 209 passed, the state was not allowed to use race in admissions. And we did move to a very aggressive socioeconomic I'm sorry to say my university filed an amicus brief in the Harvard case where it did say, well, yes, we did just admit the most racially diverse class in the history of California. And we did use socioeconomic primarily, but it's never enough. But they won't say, and this was also in the oral argument, when is it ever enough? They won't, as Ilya said, they'll never answer that question because they don't want to say it. But what they really think is when the proportions of race in the class mirror exactly the balance of race in the population, because even that's not really enough, because that's not perfect. So, but I think that's something you could do. If you look at the UC system, socioeconomic class, the strength of high schools, things like that, are things you can actually use which don't violate the Constitution's ban on the use of race, which does produce the kind of, as you said, intellectual diversity and different viewpoints you want for a successful classroom.
Yep. Kenny, what are your thoughts? 10,000 applications.
I have a slightly different perspective from John. I know, two Asians who don't think exactly alike. Who knew?
That assumption
I don't know if
is not
Harvard
made
wouldn't count that.
Not deferring to his elders, very bad. I'm going to tell you.
It's okay. My mom would probably tell me that. Yeah. So I'm afraid. I don't think we should do geographic diversity considerations or other those things, because that is used by Harvard as a proxy to discriminate against Asians, because as we know, Asians will come from bigger cities like San Francisco and New York, and so when they say, well, we don't want too many kids from San Francisco, we don't want too many kids in New York, we know who they really mean. They don't want the Asians. This is the strategy that Thomas Jefferson High School did, which I talk about in my book, An Inconvenient Minority. But Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Mathematics in Arlington, Virginia, did a geographic diversity thing that lowered the percentage of Asians by 30 to 40%. So I support admissions based on grades and SAT scores and a personal essay timed, written in a room in a single sitting. And the reason why is because you have to trust that the university system does its job. So what if you don't get into Harvard? Okay? Is it the end of the world for you? We have all of these colleges and universities that are supposed to be set up to help you wherever you are on the academic sphere. And by saying, well, we need affirmative actions for socioeconomics, or we need affirmative action for this, is basically saying that the other colleges aren't going to do a good job with you. And I don't believe that's true, I think the other colleges will do a good job with you if you're accurately placed and competitive, and if they actually try. Grades, SAT scores, and personal essays where I would go, because those are common, proven, scientific calculations of a person's academic merit.
I don't want to dictate a one-size-fits-all admissions standard nationwide. Different schools might have different goals. A state school, right, UNC is in this case, as the oldest public university in the country, they could absolutely, for very good reasons, have preferences for North Carolinians because they want to educate the next generation of leaders and what have you. And that's a perfectly valid thing for a public university to do. Other places might specialize in, who knows what, engineering or the arts or special, who knows? I don't want to dictate. But, the point is you want to have things that, you want to have a correct goal. Visual diversity, to my mind, is not a correct goal. It's an unconstitutional one as well. But a further thing, and Kenny mentioned personal essays, I like what the University of Chicago does with personal essays because it's not simply, write an essay and then, there's this whole industry about coaching you to write about how, underprivileged you were and overcame something, mentioning your race and talking about, there's a standard formula for these sorts of things. Chicago says, no. Here's 12 different essay calls. They're all very different. I'm sure you'll find something that's to your liking, but it's not just, tell a story about how, an inspirational story about how you overcame whatever. It could be, write, give us page 287 of your memoirs when you retire in 50 years. Or it could be, tell all just really quirky style things. And literally, whether you're humanities minded or science, you'll find something that you'll like. That's good. I think universities need to be more creative, and they need to focus on what exactly their goal is. Is it to have lots of people, the leaders of the country, of the state? Is it to educate the next generation of engineers? Is it, whatever the thing is? And that's all fine. I have much more. I'm just a simple constitutional lawyer. I'm not an educational official or yet a university president. But I think there's a lot of room for flexibility. And I would hope that if schools, after these rulings, change their policies and look at it in good faith, I hope there's a lot of different kinds of experimentation in admissions methodology.
Yep, so let 1,000 flowers bloom. But now on the other side, though, there are definitely people who say, okay, you're getting rid of race-based affirmative action, but what about, kids who are not prepared that are getting in because of legacy preferences, or they're a football player and they're clearly not meeting the academic standards. Should there be an equal effort to remove those kinds of preferential programs which clearly exist?
Two thoughts. One, all those other factors don't violate the Constitution. So universities are free to try, as Ilya says, experiment and try with different things. And universities can have different purposes. And I think this is the point of Chief Justice Roberts' statement or retort about oboe players is, the Civil War was fought to stop our government's terrible history in the use of race. And it's just been repeated over and over again. All those other factors are not the subject of that. The second thing, this also goes to the oral arguments at the court, is in the past, at the time of Bakke, for example, is very much a 1970s thing, the courts would defer to the experts. They'd say, Justice Powell basically says this, I don't know what to do about college admissions. Let's defer to the experts. So let's introduce the views of a university. It's not even in the case itself. Harvard University, they must know what's going on. Let's just do whatever Harvard does. That's basically what Powell's opinion says. And the one thing that's interesting about this case today is no one wants to give deference to college administrators anymore. They are the most distrusted group of profession in the country.
That's also what One was supposed to say.
It was, but instead it led to, and this is the other thing I thought that was really interesting. Another thing about the Texas cases that was important and had a lot of effect, I thought, was that a lot of other sectors of society came in and said, we got to have affirmative action too. So there were generals that had a big influence, police chiefs, all these corporate CEOs filed briefs back in these earlier cases. I think that's going to have almost no effect now because I think the court basically 20 years ago said, okay, we're going to listen to all these experts and social leaders about the need to have affirmative action, and we think They're telling us it'll be over in 25 years. Instead, what the court has seen is that it has solidified into this sort of permanent feature of all these institutions. And I think it's going to take a long time to uproot, even if the court does the right thing. But that's the other interesting thing, too. Is that, so with all these other questions, how do you design a good admission system? I think the court's not going to defer at all to the supposed experts now.
Given the apparatus that exists outside of higher education and employment, all these other areas, what do you think the implications are if race-based affirmative action is denied unconstitutional in college admissions? What's the likely impact on employers or any other arena that explicitly uses these preferences?
I think it depends on what we do with it. You know, the only thing the Supreme Court can do effectually is say we will strike down race preferences, and you're not allowed to do this anymore. But after that, it's still up to us. Look, employers are engaging in anti-meritocratic behavior by the day with their new DEI departments and prioritizing racial quotas in hiring and promoting and firing and saying you have to meet a certain this and you have to be a part of this allied group. It's very resemblant of Harvard University's system. Soon you're going to get benefits if you identify as transgender or LGBT. I don't support benefits either way. I think you should be judged on your merit. You know, I think this was a setup for my organization, Colorist United, which I serve as president of, but we tackled this increasing anti-meritocratic behavior in these corporations, and that's what we have to do. We have to fight it.
Well, private employers have different rules. You know, the reason why we have this case is there's a state school, but Harvard receives federal funding under Title VI, which has strings attached, which the jurisprudence has read to apply the same rules vis-a-vis racial discrimination as for public institutions. You know, law firms, corporations, etc. Title VI doesn't apply to them. What applies to them is the regular civil rights laws that say you can't discriminate based on race, and if someone has a colorable claim that some employment action was taken against them based on race, they can sue. There can be class actions for that matter, but it's the private employers, if they are doing something that's less blatant that you can't necessarily sue over, but they're hiring people who aren't as qualified for whatever kinds of jobs, then ultimately their bottom line is going to suffer. I think there's market corrections for that sort of thing, but if otherwise the courts are open for cases of if you can establish, again, using statistical inference to get you in the door and have discovery from HR departments about who they're hiring, that's a way to blow things open in places that are doing things blatantly.
Yep. We've mentioned a couple times this idea of people not being qualified, which is kind of the subtext of a lot of race-based affirmative action. So I run schools in the South Bronx, in the district we just opened up our high school. Only 7% of kids who start 9th grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college, right? Meaning that they start 9th grade and either drop out or they actually do earn their high school diploma but still can't do math nor reading without remediation if they were to go to college. How much do you think this likely elimination of race-based affirmative action hopefully will cast a greater light on that real issue? Because I don't want my students graduating from my high school to get in because of affirmative action. I want them to be able to compete for any position. So hopefully this is an opportunity to cast even greater light on what is in many ways a K-12 quality issue.
I was actually very much persuaded by Stephen Carter's book, Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby in the 90s, where he made exactly this argument. He said, the real scandal is K through 12 funding and organization of our schools, how poorly public schools are doing in our inner cities, regardless of race, just the poor. And he said affirmative action in a way, and he said, look, I benefited from an affirmative action probably, but it's almost like a salve. It makes people in the elites feel better, that they think they're doing something about it, but actually it's just a Band-Aid on this really big, serious social problem, which is how do we fix public schooling. So I agree. I think maybe the answer is you're already seeing responses to this, both at the state level and the private initiative level, like yourself. And the work you do is incredible. I can't imagine running a school. I can't imagine running a class of 10-year-olds. I mean, they would own me after like 30 minutes. I mean, I can't believe how much work it takes for what you're doing. So you should really, I'm very proud of you, impressed of what you're doing. But I think that states now you're starting to see, I think the ultimate answer is vouchers and school choice. You're starting to Arizona and Florida, you're seeing responses to that by people of all races. But I think the people would help the most are places like the Bronx, inner city, places like that.
I think school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. No, that's it. That's it. That's what's hard with the floating mic, because you just want to have an interjection.
I know. We're gonna take
Wait.
some questions. We've got eight minutes left. But Kenny, do you have any comment? Particularly this question about are
yeah.
our kids even being prepared in the first place?
Yeah, I don't want to say to a 5-year-old you're qualified or you're not qualified. That's not what I believe. You have so much room to grow, but by the time you reach 12th grade, your mentality on education is by and large secured. And we just have to acknowledge that reality. That's why affirmative action is not good at the 12th grade level. On the other hand, research consistently shows that when gaps form in like 5 or 6 years old, they will continue. Unless there is aggressive remediation, and every grade further requires even more aggressive remediation. So this is not just a problem of the K-12 system, this is a problem of the K-3 system.
Well, that's for sure. And I would just make the point, it's not so much that you're at the end of 12th grade, if you haven't been part of a successful system. If you aspire to go to college, Harvard isn't necessarily the right answer for every kid. It's about right fit based on your particular characteristics and then the types of supports that a college or university would provide, as well as let's have alternatives such as apprenticeships and other things, so that we don't have such a college for all mentality that creates this kind of energy that there's an expectation, I've got to go to college, I've got to go to Harvard. Questions?
Yeah, Ilya recently had a well-publicized experience at his previous employer that suggests that this conversation you're having right now could not take place at most elite campuses. How do you change elite opinion on this issue if you can't even have the conversation?
Are you bound?
No, I'm a free man, as you see from my Twitter profile. It was fortuitous. The first thing I went to after leaving Georgetown was the opening reception for the wonderful Victims of Communism Museum here in Washington, which I commend to all of you. But I got a name tag that says Victims of Communism, and it identified me with Georgetown. I crossed it out and wrote in free man. It was perfect. Anyway. Yeah, that's a dilemma. Just to repeat the question, because I don't know if it made it onto the video, but Tevi Troy asks, we can't even have this kind of conversation that we're having on college campuses. So what, how do we address that issue? I think it's much broader. I think it's instilling a culture of free speech and civil discourse, which university leaders certainly have to do. It's state legislatures, at least for public schools, can defund the DEI offices that are preventing intellectual diversity and stymieing equal opportunity and excluding those with divergent viewpoints. It's really an Orwellian sort of thing. But it's that's a bigger issue. I mean, as I think you alluded to this, if students are more admitted on merit, there's less mismatch, there's less racial resentment and things like that. That would help campus culture as well.
John, do you face this at Berkeley?
It's interesting. I think at the student level, I find the students are different. So we're of the generation, I think, where we have a panel, students come and you air these out. I actually find that college-age students, they consume things on their screens. And so if you put a panel presentation together like this one and put it on the web, it's almost like you've made the talk available to every undergraduate, and they can choose to see and view what they want. And So in a weird way, technology is actually making it possible to have these conversations even in places that might not be the most friendly. The other odd thing I think is, it goes to this racial diversity thing is like being a high church of college administrators. I'm not sure how many professors really believe it. It's almost, it is, Ilya raised Orwell. It's almost like there's a double speak. People have to say one thing, even though they may be deep believers in merit and scholarly productivity and being a good teacher, but they feel they have to mouth all these platitudes in the exact right way so that their salary will go up, or they won't get chastised, or they'll be attacked. Or what happened to Ilya at Hastings? You won't have all these crazy people preventing him from speaking. Welcome to the club, Ilya.
Oh, gosh.
But so I guess the real question, the heart of it is, are people being exposed to the ideas? Are you able to really discuss them? And somehow I think maybe technology is saving us from the older model where it was easier to suppress ideas.
Last question.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could comment on what might be viewed as a natural experiment in this area. I remember from the book Mismatch that Stuart Taylor wrote, there was a reference at one point to how students who attend historically black colleges and universities have better outcomes. And I don't recall them going into too much detail on that, but that struck me as being really significant, because you almost by definition can't do what we're talking about that the court might strike down. And is there any data or any kind of insight you might have about does that may help make the case? And I don't know if that came up in the course of the oral arguments either. I haven't heard anyone.
Does that help make
Yeah.
the case of what?
That if African American or minority students can go to colleges and universities, and you by definition don't have a screening device of race, and yet they're doing well, is the mismatch theory kind of indicated there, and that you're actually hurting kids when you put them artificially in schools where they're 200, 300 points below the SAT norm or whatever.
Yeah, what Stuart Taylor said about better outcomes is what happens is that the kids who will go to HBCUs will be more incentivized to stay in the math and science majors. He was specifically talking about STEM outcomes. And this is what happens in what he calls PWIs, predominantly white universities. Students of color, black kids will choose a major, and then they will switch out of it at a much higher rate than the rest of the population. It is sad. But why he says that's a better outcome is because all the research shows that your starting salary in your career is more determined by your major choice than it is by the prestige of the college that you select. So this is why I don't buy into this whole, well, Harvard needs more of these students in order to serve them and serve that community, because your outcomes are far more determined by the choices that you make in your major than they are by the prestige of the college that accepts you.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that example, it's not that if they're doing better, a black kid in a historically black college is because they're black, it's because the behaviors, it sounds like, that are encouraging you to persist. So it's, in almost all of these things, it's focused on the behavior, not necessarily the artificial construct of race. We have 1 minute left, 20-second closing statements to say your most brilliant point.
I mean, that's kind of on the spot here. All of this and everything that I'm doing, everything that I'm writing about is because I believe in meritocracy. And I believe that a culture of excellence is facilitated when people are incentivized by the right things, specifically to work hard, to put effort, and to gain valuable skills.
One thing we didn't talk about was morality. What is the morality of judging people based on their skin color? I think it's not just the Constitution prohibits it. I think the Declaration of Independence announces a value that stands for our whole country, which is everyone is created equal. We don't judge people on the basis of their group identities or race, and it's a moral value and truth that our country should always be striving to reach. We have been, we've had setbacks, but I still have a lot of optimism that in the United States we're going to reach it, certainly more likely here than any other country in the world.
I've been highly critical of Chief Justice Roberts across a spectrum of cases over the years and his overall approach to things. But in this area, I mean, I don't think you can say it better than as it came out during oral argument that it's a sordid business, this divvying us up by race from one of his early cases, and that the way to stop racial discrimination is to stop discriminating based on race.
Yep, outstanding. The school that I've just launched is organized around the principles of equality of opportunity, individual dignity, and our common humanity. Let's hope that this decision unleashes that kind of sentiment for all of our kids. Thank you very much, guys. That was amazing.